contact. You know, there was a report by Women's Aid several years ago. It was called 19 children were killed by a violent father after contact had been ordered by a court.
Talking about domestic abuse and handling by family courts, what can you tell us about it, and also the effect on the children?
Sure. Okay, so yeah, as we know through official figures, domestic abuse is very common. At least 2 to 3 women are killed a week by their partner or their ex-partner. The government official figures say that 1 in 3 women over the age of 16 will suffer domestic violence in their lifetime. And the violence often gets worse or becomes very common when a woman gets pregnant or after she's had her child, because then she has less time, you know, to spend with her husband. And that's when violence can get really bad. And the most dangerous time for a woman to leave is, the most dangerous time for a woman is when she leaves. But, you know, if a woman leaves, quite often a violent man will take her through the family courts, because that's the only other way he can then control her. She's left, so he hasn't got any control anymore. And, you know, we said that the criminal courts are really bad, but the family court, firstly, one thing about the family court is that it's a closed court. So if you're a mum going through the family court, the only person you're allowed to discuss anything to do with that case with is either your lawyer or your legal representative, whoever that is. You're not even allowed to speak to your mum, your sister, your best friend. You're not allowed to discuss it.
What is the rationale behind not talking to anybody else except the lawyer?
Well, how the courts rationalise it is by saying that, you know, if we opened these courts and they became public, then, you know, children's details will be made public, and that's not fair on the child. The child has a right to anonymity. But our argument is, well, victims of rape have anonymity in the criminal court. So you could open the family courts so that people are aware of what's going on, the decisions that are being made, how they operate, and still keep the child anonymous. It wouldn't be difficult to do, but that's their argument for keeping them closed. But what that means that we have seen in the family court is the outrageous sexism, racism, that the class divide in the family court. We work very closely with Support Not Separation, who are based at the Crossroads Women's Centre, who help mums that are going through the family court. And we've been doing that for years now.
Families need fathers have a long track record since the 90s for denying domestic violence. What's happening at the moment is that women, mothers and children are at risk when we go to the family courts, because judges, with the complicity of organizations like CAFCAS, with the complicity of social services, are only too happy to give violent fathers unsupervised contact and even residence of their children.
And from our own figures, we can see that from the women that come to us every year, over 90% of the women that come to us for help in the family court, there's an element of violence in their case. And they're women of colour. So that straight away tells you that the family courts are dripping with racism. Most of the women, not all of them, but the majority of women are poor or have less power, wealth and status than the man that's taken them through the court. Like Chrissy said earlier, a lot of children are taken under the guise of neglect when actually we're living in poverty. And Section 17 of the Children's Act states that that resources should be given to keep families together rather than separate them. But most women are not told about Section 17 and what resources they can get by their local authorities when they're involved in family court with them. So the problem in the family court is, one, that it's closed. People don't know what's going on. So what normally happens is, again, as Chris said, sometimes women get really bad advice by their own lawyers. a lot of women's lawyers, if they've got legal representation, will tell them not to raise the rape or domestic violence that they've suffered, because they'll say, well, if you do that, you could be accused of parental alienation. And the courts use parental alienation to dismiss women's allegations of rape and domestic violence and the children's allegations. Quite often, when children are old enough to say why they don't want to go and see their father because there's been violence, if they've heard or witnessed domestic violence or been a victim themselves, they're just dismissed or disbelieved. So, and then, if it's not the father raising parental alienation, none of these allegations are true. She's just trying to alienate me from my children so she can go off and have a new life. If it's not the father's raising it, it'll often be a judge raising it. The father might not have even have said that. And, a case will come before a judge and he'll hear, well, the mum is saying this and the dad is saying that, and the judge will make his own decision. Well, actually, I think that, this could be a case of alienation. So we need to get, the so-called experts brought in. So, social workers, guardians, children's lawyers even. We've worked with mums where the children are even saying to the guardian or the social worker, I don't want to see my dad because he's violent to me. Or, there's been cases of smacking or humiliation. And I remember there was one case where the little boy was saying in particular, I don't want to see my dad. Neither of the children did, but he really didn't want to. And the interview, the social worker was saying, okay, well, if you had to see him in this situation or that situation, which one would you prefer? So he's thinking about it and he's like, well, if I had to see him, I'd see him in this situation. So then she goes back to court and says, well, actually, he wants to see his dad because he said he'd see him in this setting. That's the way that children are completely ignored.
Yeah, it's a typical strategy. They like, especially it's disgusting because they use it even with children. They like restrict choices and they tell you, oh, you can do this or that, whereas you have multiple choices. And it's disgusting that you use this against children.
Yeah, and that's what we see all the time. And when the mothers are really frightened for their children and they feel like they're banging their head against a brick wall and nobody's listening to them, they're then accused of being hysterical, or the judges will say, well, you're not able to help your child maintain a good relationship with the dad. You're going to cause that child possible future emotional harm. They're accusing a mother of something that hasn't even happened yet, but they're saying, well, you're going to cause emotional harm to your child because you're going to deprive her of the right of a relationship with her father. They will often take the child away from their mother, who is their utmost, most fiercest protector, and they will either be put in care or with the violent father. And, we know as well, studies are coming out all the time that shows the impact of a child either being removed from its mother or being put into care. There's a lot of studies that come out saying that if you've been in care, you're going to do less well in life, with regards to jobs, families, relationships, than you are if you've been, if you've had that relationship with your mum. So, it's another massive problem. And what happens in the criminal courts obviously has an impact, because if you're going into the family court and you're saying, okay, he's been violent to me and he's been violent to the kids, if you don't have that evidence in the form of a conviction or the police believing you or the police backing you up, then what evidence do you have to show that that guy's violent? I mean, even when you do have evidence, a lot of the time the court authorities and the judges will say, okay, so he has a conviction for either harassment of the mother or, assault, or there have been cases of rape. And the judge will say, but that was against the mother. Just because he's violent towards the mother doesn't necessarily follow that he'll be violent to the child. But, tell that to the mothers whose children have been killed after court-ordered contact. There was a report by Women's Aid several years ago. It was called 19 children were killed by a violent father after contact had been ordered by a court. And it's really a terrible place to be, because there's one thing being really frightened that you're going to come to harm by your ex-partner, but it's a completely different level of fear when you have to hand your children over for unsupervised contact to a man when you know what he's capable of. And, you can understand why women stay with violent men, because they think, well, if I go through the family court, my kid's going to be taken away from me, and at least I can keep them safer when we're all together, rather than just having to, send my kids off and I'm not there to protect them. So it's a really big problem. Like I say, cuts to legal aid mean that often women are cross-examined by the violent ex-partner. There is something called Practice Direction 12J, which is meant to be implemented by courts if there's been allegations of violence. So, the woman isn't cross-examined by the man himself. But, a lot of the times Practice 12J isn't even raised when it's a domestic violence case. So this is still going on. The pandemic has made it far worse because now, since 2020, when hearings became remote in the family court, judges are now making decisions about the care of a child without the woman even being in a courtroom and being able to speak her truth and argue her case. So, again, we have a really great self-help guide, Support Not Separation, for mothers going through the family court. And again, it tells you what your rights are. It tells you what you can do. It goes through, what should happen in the family court, and what you can do if things aren't, being dealt with properly. So, how you raise things with your lawyer, how you challenge, the lies that are being told about you by the authorities. Because if you just go straight in there saying, well, that's a lie, and that's a lie, and that's a lie, you're then told that you can't work with professionals. And so you don't have your child's best interest at heart. It really is it needs a massive, massive overhaul. And we're not sure that the domestic abuse bill is going to do that. But with regards to the pandemic, I'll just say very quickly, some figures that show that as soon as lockdown started, the domestic violence increased. So after a couple of months, by mid-May, the Office of National Statistics reported there was a 12% increase in the number of domestic abuse cases that have been referred to victim support. And then between the next couple of months, between April and June, there was a 65% increase in calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline in comparison to the first couple of months in 2020. Calls to the London Metropolitan Police also increased, but they were mainly by third parties that were calling because they were concerned about somebody they knew, or they could hear violence from their neighbours. In the first 3 weeks of lockdown, there were 16 domestic abuse killings of women and children, and that was the highest it had been for 11 years. So last May, the government gave £25 million of funding to domestic abuse services. And then last November, the Ministry of Justice provided over £10 million to boost fundings for domestic abuse services. But our argument is, where is that money going to, and how is it helping the women on the ground? Because we just don't see it. I mean, with the domestic abuse bill, the Domestic Abuse Act came into force in April this year. But when you look at it, how is it going to practically help women? We campaigned, we lobbied Parliament, our demands were ignored. We wanted the domestic abuse bill to not be gender neutral, because, the overwhelming figures show that it's overwhelmingly women that are victims of domestic violence and men that are the perpetrators. And even if you're talking about men that are in relationships with other men, well, the man is still the perpetrator in that relationship. So if you're going to make the Domestic Abuse Act gender neutral, that means that we're up against even more than we already have been. Because if the police are called out to a dispute, and there's a man alleging that the woman's been violent as well, it's now law that, well, actually, if the bill's gender neutral and it can happen to anyone, you've got to believe the man as well. I mean, not that they don't already, because we're already up against it, but it's going to make it even harder. And just as an example, I witnessed a woman being attacked in the street a couple of weeks ago near where I live. And we called 999, we chased the guy off, but she was too frightened to give her address to the police because she lived with her parents and she was at risk of honour-based violence because they didn't even know she had a boyfriend. And the call handler straight away said I was being the kind of the third party on the call, but she was so traumatised. And she said to me, well, if she doesn't give her address, we can't do anything. This is before the police had even come out to see us. So I said, okay, well, let's see what the police say when they get here. She said, well, that could take an hour. So we're on the street, not knowing if this guy is going to come back. He'd bitten her ear and done other things. We were told it was going to take an hour. We had to stay there but it was going to take an hour, you know, by which time she could have been killed. He could have come back. So why wasn't that a priority call? You know, why isn't the fact that a violent man attacking a woman on a busy street, he's not even doing it behind closed doors, he's, you know, so sure that he can get away with this, that he's attacking her on a busy street in front of people. Why is that not seen as a priority? I'd like to know what other calls the police were attending before they got to us. Well, they didn't even get to us because in the end she left because she was so frightened of being there. And when I called the police to say, look, she's gone because she's too frightened to stay, they were like, well, we can't cancel this call. It's our priority. It's our policy to always attend the domestic abuse call, no matter how late it is. So I said, well, you can turn up, but there's nobody there now. So they weren't very happy with that. But then they kept calling her the following week because I'd taken photos of her injuries. We kept in touch. And she said to me, Nicola, I'm so frightened because the police keep telling me that if I don't cooperate with them, they'll take the matter out of my hands anyway. But how is that helping her when she's not only a victim of serious violence, but she's also at risk from her own family? Why is their policy that they'll always attend the call out, but then what they do after that is putting her in more danger? I mean, it just doesn't make sense at all. Because, you know, what you should be doing is protecting the woman from the violence and not doing something that's going to make it worse. Is also, what do you do when the rapists are the police, and what do you do when the police are the perpetrators? And just recently here in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of exposure on violent police officers that are in the force, that are actually working with members of the public who are victims. You know, that's a really big problem. And we think that, you know, if you're an officer who's been convicted of domestic violence, then you shouldn't be working in the force. You should be sacked and prosecuted, because how can you keep women safe? How can you be not biased? How can you be neutral and be protective of a woman that's you've been called out to when you're beating your wife at home? You know, that's a big problem, but it is coming out now, so that's good.
Can I just add to that very briefly? I mean, it's obviously there's been a huge outpouring of victims of all kinds of sexual violence since the Sarah Everard murder. But one of the things that's been quite striking has been the number of police officers and ex-police women officers who've been speaking out about their own colleagues and about violence they themselves have suffered, as well as the wives of police officers talking about domestic violence, like Nicola's saying. And it's really useful that they've called out not only the domestic violence and rape at home, but also sexual harassment among colleagues and the lower level of prosecutions of those officers. And also how they've said it's really commonplace that abusive officers join the force because they obviously can have access to vulnerable people. And part of that is that they expect to have sex with women who've reported rape and other vulnerable victims of crime. So it's, you know, we've said that for many years that was going on because women were reporting it to us, but it's really good that it's now coming to public attention. It's undeniable.
And it's also probably the same issue inside of the detention centres, you know, where the guards get their jobs, go for the same jobs for the same reason that the police do. You know, I think one of the police women said that for the men, it's a bit like being in a sweetie shop. You know, and I think if you've got women in detention, you know, vulnerable women, it's the same, you know, the same issue about they're women that you can treat the way you want because who cares? They're going to be deported anyway. But, you know, they've been speaking out against that. And it's good in the same way that the movements inside to resist this stuff are not ready to stay silent and suffer, you know.
Yeah, that's good. That there's some form of publicity around this, and yeah, it's not surprising at all because you have these sorts of jobs like cop or detention center officer, or these are positions of power, and it does attract people who are power thirsty and control freaks and so on. So you will have those elements if they are not filtered out during recruitment. And I'm sure even doctors or psychologists who who give them tests and so on themselves, I'm sure they are pretty much biased, if not more. So yeah, you will find plenty of those people in those positions. So yeah, it is expected that they will take advantage of their position, of their power. Another point which was very interesting that you mentioned earlier, Nicola, is that is the fact that yeah, abusive or violent men tend to be more violent when they marry or when they have kids with their wife. Probably because they know that the woman will be first will want to have a father figure for her children, even if the father is dysfunctional, to say the least. So to some extent, she will still try to remain with that guy, I'm guessing. Another reason is, yeah, the financial dependence.
That's the biggest one.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest one, right? And yeah, there's so many reasons and violent men are aware of this. Obviously, they know how the system works and when they can prey on their victims. So yeah, this is. I mean, I've been interested in criminology in the recent years, and I've been watching tons and tons of documentaries on this. And if there's one thing that stood out, it's the fact that by far most victims are women. And also, if there's a pattern that I have noticed, it's that the violence often came, yeah, when the woman was pregnant, basically, or right after they got married, or something like that. So yeah, I think that's very obvious. I mean, yeah, every woman should be aware of this at some point because it's apparently it's so blatant and it's so widespread.
It's very widespread amongst women who are seeking asylum, who may be or whose status actually depends on staying with a violent partner, because the partners all know that there's a hotline to the Home Office that they can just pick up and call when they're fed up, when they want to change the part, you know, when they want somebody new, or they're having rows, you know, and women are really, you know, in a really vulnerable situation then, because the man has got in first and told the Home Office, we're not in a relationship, or she lied to you about her this and that and the other. So, you know, and the other thing I was thinking while I was speaking was that the other issue around why men are doing some of this, particularly when it's an issue of racist attacks and racism that, you know, sometimes is combined with the sexual violence. See, the example again is Yarswood, where the Channel 4 television program really exposed the kind of racist treatment in one of the detention centers, which goes hand in hand with it. And we see that is also a right, you know, the right-wing politics are totally wrapped up in the suppression of women's rights and their ability to be brutal at every level. You know, so we don't know what the political affiliations are of the police that are involved. You know, when they join, you don't know whether they're members of the EDL. And when you look at the way in which, you know, officers have put the knee in the neck or beaten, and you almost can see written on their faces very large that part of what's behind this is also their political beliefs, you know, that we are less than worth bothering with, particularly if we're of color, but not only.
Absolutely. And one thing that I've discovered recently is that well, I follow what's happening in France more than other Western countries because I've lived there for some time, and I know that I mean, according to many testimonies of cops, I mean, what they say is that even if you are not a racist when you enter this sort of job, you will become a racist because it's the job that will make you a racist. It's the prejudice associated with the job. It's the way you. I mean, there is the bias again. There's a bias towards always going after brown people, black people, and of course, some of them will be caught doing illegal stuff. But then the bias makes it look like, oh, it's mostly brown and black people who are criminals. Whereas it's because of the bias that the statistics are are biased, basically.
In the next part,
we've really taken that as a point of principle, that women of different races and nationalities, different sexualities, immigrants and asylum seekers, women with disabilities, we come together and work out fundamentally how we're connected and how we have to find the things that we have in common, and fight this stuff together.